In December 1963, a reservoir above Los Angeles failed and sent water rushing into the neighborhood below. It was not the largest dam in America. It was not hidden in a remote canyon. It sat above ordinary streets, homes, and people who trusted the infrastructure above them to hold. But what makes Baldwin Hills so disturbing is not only that the dam broke. It is that the warning came hours before the failure. People saw something was wrong. Emergency action began. The neighborhood was evacuated. And still, the reservoir could not be saved. This is the story of the Baldwin Hills Dam Failure, and how a warning can save lives, even when it comes too late to stop the system from failing. At 11:15 on a Saturday morning, the first warning was not a roar. It was not a wall of water. It was not the sound of a city realizing that something above it was about to fail. It was water moving where it should not have been. Above Los Angeles, in the Baldwin Hills, a reservoir sat on high ground with ordinary streets and homes below it. From a distance, it looked controlled, a quiet piece of infrastructure. Concrete, earth, asphalt, pipes, drains, and stored water held in place by design. That morning, the reservoir was still doing what it had been built to do. But during an inspection, the caretaker noticed something unusual. There was abnormal water activity around the drainage system, the kind of detail that would not mean much to someone passing by, but meant everything inside a reservoir built to keep water separated from the ground beneath it. A dam does not always announce failure with a crack across the sky. Sometimes it begins with a drain. Sometimes the first sign is hidden below the surface, where water has found a path that the design was supposed to prevent. That was the frightening part of Baldwin Hills. The danger was not invisible forever. The warning came hours before the breach. People saw that something was wrong. Emergency action began. Police would be asked to evacuate the area below, and that warning mattered. It saved lives, but it could not save the dam. By the middle of the afternoon, the quiet warning from the drainage system would become something much larger. A hole would begin forming in the slope. The reservoir would keep losing its fight against the pressure behind it, and at 3:38, the wall would open. A massive volume of water would rush down from the hills into the neighborhood below. 5 people would be killed. Homes would be damaged or destroyed. Streets that had looked ordinary that morning would become part of a disaster map. The story of Baldwin Hills is not simply the story of a dam that broke. It is the story of a system that detected danger, reacted to danger, and still ran out of time. That is what makes it different. This was not a case where nobody noticed anything until the final moment. The warning was there. The response began. The evacuation helped prevent a far worse death toll. So the question is not just why the dam failed. The question is harder than that. How did a reservoir above Los Angeles show warning signs for hours and still collapse into the neighborhood below? To answer that, we have to go beneath the surface of the water, beneath the asphalt liner, and into the ground the reservoir was built on. Because the first sign was water in the drains. But the real problem had been growing underneath. Baldwin Hills Reservoir was not built as a monument. It was built to be useful. In the years after Los Angeles kept expanding outward, the city needed water stored close enough to serve the communities growing across its southern and southwestern neighborhoods. A reservoir on high ground could do that. It could hold a large supply of water above the city and help feed the system below. To most people living near it, the reservoir was probably not something they thought about every day. It was part of the background, a fenced piece of infrastructure, a place on the hill, something controlled by engineers, inspected by workers, and trusted because trust is what ordinary life requires. You drive under bridges without thinking about every bolt. You pass retaining walls without studying the soil behind them. You live below a reservoir because the system is supposed to know what it is doing. And for years, Baldwin Hills Reservoir seemed to be doing exactly that. But the place where it stood was not simple ground. The Baldwin Hills are part of a complicated landscape shaped by faults, movement, and stress beneath the surface. The Inglewood Fault System was known. The ground in the area was not just a passive platform waiting to hold a reservoir forever. It could shift, it could settle, it could move in ways that mattered to anything built on top of it. That did not automatically mean the reservoir was doomed. Engineering is often built around imperfect sites. Roads cross bad soil. Buildings rise in earthquake country. Dams and reservoirs are placed where the need exists, then designed with the risks in mind. The question is not whether the ground was difficult. The question is whether the design could survive the kind of movement the ground might produce. At Baldwin Hills, the reservoir depended on separation. The water had to stay where it belonged. Above it was the open reservoir. Around it were earth embankments and the dam itself. Beneath the stored water were sealing layers, including asphalt and earth materials, meant to stop water from finding a path into the foundation below. Drains underneath the liner were there to collect and reveal leakage before it became something worse. In plain language, the reservoir was built around a simple idea. Keep the water above. Keep the vulnerable ground below protected. And if water started appearing in the wrong place, the drains would help show that something had changed. That is why the first warning mattered so much. A reservoir can tolerate many ordinary stresses: sun, wind, small changes in water level, routine maintenance, normal seepage within expected limits. But it cannot safely tolerate stored water cutting a hidden path through weak material beneath the structure. Water is patient. It does not need a wide opening at first. It only needs a path. If the liner cracks, if the sealing layers lose their protection, if movement in the ground creates a route for water to escape downward, the danger changes. The reservoir is no longer just holding water. It is feeding water into a place where erosion can grow. That is the part that can be hard to see from the surface. A dam may still look intact, while the failure process has already begun underneath it. The slope may still be standing. The water may still look calm. The neighborhood below may still look normal. But inside the system, the margin of safety can be getting thinner. The designers of Baldwin Hills understood that the geology was difficult. They knew the fault system existed, but the working assumption was that any movement or settlement would not be large enough to compromise the liner in a way that the reservoir could not withstand. That assumption would become one of the most important parts of the disaster, not because it was obviously foolish in the moment, but because when it proved wrong, the warning would not appear as a dramatic collapse. It would appear as abnormal water in the drains. On that Saturday morning, when the caretaker noticed something unusual, he was not just seeing a maintenance issue. He was seeing the first visible sign that the separation had failed. Water was no longer staying where the system needed it to stay. And once that became clear, the clock began to move much faster. By late morning, the warning at Baldwin Hills was no longer just a strange detail in the drainage system. It was becoming an emergency. The first sign had been subtle: water moving through drains at a rate that did not look normal. But in a reservoir, abnormal drainage is never just about the water you can see. It points to the water you cannot see. It suggests that somewhere beneath the surface, stored water may have found a path through the layers that were supposed to keep it contained. The response began with the tools the system had. The outlet works were used to lower the reservoir. The goal was simple: get water out, reduce pressure, and buy time. The less water pushing against the damaged area, the better the chance of slowing whatever was happening inside the structure. But there was a problem that no one could solve quickly. A reservoir holding that much water could not be drained safely in a few minutes. It could not even be drained safely in a couple of hours. Emptying it completely would take far longer than the failure process unfolding inside the hill. That is the cruel math of a disaster like this. The warning comes at 11:15. The structure is already compromised. The water must be lowered. But the water cannot be lowered fast enough. From the outside, that can sound almost impossible. If the danger was spotted before the collapse, why not just drain the reservoir and stop the disaster? But infrastructure does not move at the speed of fear. Large systems have limits. Pipes have capacity. Outlet works can only release water at certain rates. Drainage must be controlled, because releasing water too quickly can create new hazards downstream. And while the reservoir was being lowered, the damage inside the structure was still advancing. The clock was not controlled by the people responding. It was controlled by water, pressure, soil, and the hidden path that had opened beneath the liner. By early afternoon, the danger was no longer confined to the reservoir itself. The neighborhood below had entered the story. At about 1:30, with conditions worsening and not enough time to drain the reservoir before the threat became critical, police were asked to evacuate the area downstream. This is an important part of Baldwin Hills. The warning was not meaningless. It did not vanish into a filing cabinet. It did not sit quietly until the dam failed. The emergency response moved outward from the reservoir and into the streets below. People were told to leave. The danger was no longer an engineering problem on a hill. It was a public safety emergency in a Los Angeles neighborhood. For the people living below, the reservoir had been part of the landscape, a structure above them, a fact of the city, not something that shaped every hour of the day. Then, suddenly, it mattered where their house stood. It mattered how far they were from the flow path. It mattered whether they heard the warning, understood it, and had time to get out. Evacuation changed the outcome. It gave many people a chance to leave before the breach came. That is why the Baldwin Hills story should not be told as if no one reacted. The response mattered. The warning saved lives. But saving lives was not the same as saving the dam. Up on the hill, the structure was still losing its race against time. Every gallon released through the outlet works helped reduce pressure. But every minute also gave water more time to exploit the damage path below. Once erosion begins inside vulnerable material, it can grow faster than people expect. A small route can widen. A leak can become a channel. A hidden weakness can turn into visible failure. And that is what made the next stage so dangerous. The first warning had been water in the drains. The next warning would be much harder to misunderstand. The damage was about to show itself on the face of the dam. At about 2:20 in the afternoon, the danger changed shape. For hours, the warning had been mostly hidden inside the system. Water in the wrong place. Drainage that did not look normal. A problem beneath the surface, moving through layers most people would never see. Now it was visible. A hole was forming on the upstream slope of the dam. That detail matters. Until that moment, the failure was still something the system was trying to interpret and control. It could be measured in drainage, pressure, flow, and emergency response. It could be fought with outlet works and evacuation orders. It was serious, but much of it was still taking place inside the structure. Once the hole appeared, the disaster became harder to deny. The dam was no longer only leaking, it was changing. On a reservoir, a hole on the upstream side is not just a mark in the surface. It can be a sign that water has begun removing material from where material is supposed to stay. The stored water is not passive. It pushes, it searches, it pulls at weakness. And if erosion opens a path, the force of the reservoir can make that path larger. Emergency personnel and water department workers continued trying to respond. The effort was no longer just about noticing a problem. It was about slowing a failure already in motion. The outlet works were being used. Debris had to be dealt with. Water had to be moved out in a controlled way. The goal was still to reduce pressure, slow the erosion, and keep the damage from becoming a full breach. But the clock was tightening. The reservoir needed time to be drawn down safely. The dam did not have that time. This is one of the hardest parts of the Baldwin Hills story. The response was real. The warning was real. The evacuation was real. But the physical process inside the dam was becoming faster than the human response around it. Once water finds a route through vulnerable material, the situation can accelerate. What begins as seepage can become erosion. Erosion can enlarge the path. A larger path allows more water through. More water removes more material. The failure feeds itself. That is why a small visible change can be so dangerous. It may not show the beginning of the disaster. It may show that the beginning has already happened, hidden below the surface, and that the structure is now catching up to the damage inside it. The hole on the slope was not the first warning. It was the warning becoming undeniable. Below the reservoir, evacuation was still the most important action. People had to get out of the path of whatever might come down from the hill. For many residents, the danger would have felt sudden. That morning, the reservoir was just part of the city. By afternoon, it was the reason they had to leave. Above them, workers were still trying to keep the structure from failing completely. But the hole kept growing. The pressure behind it did not pause. The water stored in the reservoir did not wait for the neighborhood to clear or for the emergency response to catch up. It kept pressing against the damaged area, and the damaged area kept losing strength. Minute by minute, the reservoir was moving closer to the point where control would be gone. A dam breach is not always a single instant. Sometimes there is a long, quiet failure before the visible one. The hidden damage builds. The first signs appear. The response begins. Then, suddenly, the system reaches a point where the structure can no longer hold back what it was built to contain. At Baldwin Hills, that point was approaching. From 2:20 onward, the story becomes a countdown, not because anyone knew every detail of what would happen next, but because the dam was running out of margin. The water had already found a path. The slope had already opened. The emergency systems could reduce the danger, but they could not reverse the damage fast enough. The evacuation could move people away from the flood path, but it could not put the hillside back together. That is the difference between warning and prevention. A warning can buy time. A warning can save lives. A warning can turn a catastrophe into something less deadly than it might have been. But once the structure itself is failing, a warning cannot always stop the failure. By mid-afternoon, Baldwin Hills Reservoir was no longer just a reservoir with a problem. It was a reservoir on the edge of breach. The water, the ground, the cracked protection beneath the surface, and the growing hole in the slope were now part of the same chain. And at the end of that chain was the neighborhood below. There was still time for some people to get out. There was still time for emergency workers to act. But there was no longer enough time to save the dam. At 3:38, the last barrier gave way. At 3:38 in the afternoon, Baldwin Hills Dam failed completely. The hole that had been growing on the slope became a breach. The reservoir was no longer contained. A major volume of stored water began rushing out of the opening and down from the hills into the neighborhood below. For hours, the danger had been measured in warnings, drain flow, outlet works, evacuation, and a growing failure inside the structure. Now it was moving through the streets. Water that had been held above Los Angeles was suddenly released into ordinary places. Roads, homes, small businesses, the spaces where people had started the day, expecting a normal Saturday. The flood did not arrive as an idea or a technical problem. It arrived as force. It carried debris. It damaged property. It pushed through the built environment below the reservoir and left parts of the neighborhood changed in minutes. This is where the human cost has to be handled carefully. 5 people were killed. That number should not be treated as small. It should not be treated as a lucky footnote. 5 lives were lost, and many more people saw their homes damaged or destroyed, their streets flooded, and their sense of safety broken by something that had been sitting above them for years. At the same time, the evacuation mattered. The warning that began at the reservoir did not stop the dam from failing, but it gave emergency responders time to move people out of the path below. That response helped prevent a much larger loss of life. It is one of the most important facts in the entire story. The tragedy of Baldwin Hills is that both things are true. The warning saved lives, and the dam still failed. For the people who had evacuated, the disaster was not over when they reached safety. They still had to wait, not knowing what would be left behind. For others, the flood forced desperate movement to higher ground, rooftops, or safer structures until rescue could reach them. Helicopters and emergency workers became part of the scene, not as spectacle but as evidence of how quickly a neighborhood had been turned into a disaster zone. The water eventually moved on. The damage remained. Houses were damaged or destroyed. Streets and yards were left covered with debris. A reservoir that had once been part of the city's hidden support system had become the source of one of its most visible failures. But if the story ends there, it misses the most important question. Because the breach was not the beginning. It was the final visible result of something that had already gone wrong beneath the surface. The dam did not suddenly fail for no reason at 3:38. The warning had appeared hours earlier. The drains had shown abnormal water. A hole had formed on the slope. Workers had tried to lower the reservoir. Police had been asked to evacuate the area below. The visible disaster was the end of a chain. So after the water had rushed through the neighborhood, after the emergency response, after the damage and the loss, investigators had to look backward. They had to ask what had failed before the wall opened. Was it the dam itself? Was it the liner? Was it the ground beneath the reservoir? Was it the assumptions built into the design? The answer was not one simple object, one single moment, or one person making one obvious mistake. The failure at Baldwin Hills was hidden in the relationship between water, ground, movement, and protection. The reservoir had depended on a barrier. Once that barrier was compromised, water found a path where it was never supposed to go. And once water found that path, it began doing what water does over time. It widened the weakness. It carried material away. It turned a hidden flaw into a visible hole, and then it turned that hole into a breach. To understand why the warning could save people but not the dam, We have to look under the reservoir itself. The safest way to understand the failure is as a chain. First, the ground beneath the reservoir moved or settled in ways that mattered to the structure above it. Baldwin Hills was not a simple site. It sat in a landscape shaped by faulting, deformation, and human activity around the ground below. That movement did not have to destroy the reservoir all at once. It only had to damage the protection the reservoir depended on. The reservoir's liner and sealing layers were meant to keep stored water separated from the ground underneath. They were the barrier between a controlled water supply above and vulnerable material below. But if movement opened cracks, separated layers, or created a path through that protection, then the reservoir changed. It was no longer simply holding water. It was feeding water into the ground. Once the protective separation was compromised, seepage could begin. Water could move downward through places where it was never supposed to travel. The drains could reveal that something had changed, but the drains could not repair the damaged path. That is the crucial difference. Detection is not repair. A warning can tell people that a system is failing. It cannot always put the system back together. And once water entered vulnerable material below the reservoir, erosion became the next step in the chain. This process is dangerous because it can accelerate. Water finds a small root. The root carries soil or weak material away. The opening becomes larger. More water follows. More material is removed. The damage grows from the inside outward until the surface finally shows what has already been happening below. That is why the hole on the slope was so important. It was not the beginning of the failure. It was the failure becoming visible. The investigation did not need a single villain to explain the disaster. It needed to understand how separate weaknesses connected. Ground movement, damaged protection, seepage, erosion, breach. Each step made the next step more likely. The geology below Baldwin Hills made that process more serious. The Inglewood Fault System and ground deformation in the area belonged to the background of the story. Nearby oil field activity also belonged in that background, because the ground in the area had been affected by movement and subsidence over time. But that is not the same as saying one company, one well, or one operation directly caused the dam to fail. The safer conclusion is also the more useful one. Baldwin Hills failed because the reservoir depended on a separation that did not survive the conditions beneath it. When that separation failed, water reached places it was never supposed to reach. When water reached those places, erosion began. And when erosion grew faster than the reservoir could be drained, the warning could save people but not the dam. That is the uncomfortable lesson. The system had a way to notice danger. It had workers who responded. It had emergency action. It had evacuation. But the physical failure had already started inside the structure. By the time the warning became visible, the reservoir was already in a race against a process that had begun underground. After the breach, Baldwin Hills was no longer just the name of a reservoir. It became a warning. The water had moved through the neighborhood and left behind damaged homes, broken streets, debris, and the harder damage that does not show up neatly in engineering reports. For the people who lived below the hill, the disaster was not an abstract lesson about geology or design. It was the day a trusted piece of the city failed above them. The reservoir had looked controlled. It had been inspected. It had systems meant to detect trouble. And still, by the time the warning appeared, the most important failure was already moving beneath the surface. That is what made Baldwin Hills matter beyond one neighborhood. It showed that an off-stream reservoir could not be treated as harmless just because it was not a giant dam in a remote canyon. A reservoir inside a city, above homes and streets, could carry the same kind of consequence. It could fail in a way that gave warning, but not enough warning. It could look ordinary until the day the ground, the liner, the drains, and the stored water all became part of the same emergency. 2 years later, California changed its water code. In 1965, off-stream storage reservoirs were brought under the jurisdiction of the state's dam safety oversight. That change matters because it shows what the disaster forced into view. The risk was not only in the height of a dam or the size of a reservoir. The risk was also in where it stood, what was below it, what assumptions were built into it, and how much time people would have if those assumptions failed. That is the lesson Baldwin Hills left behind. A warning system is necessary, but a warning system is not the same as safety. Safety has to exist before the warning. It has to be built into the site selection, the design, the inspections, the drainage, the regulation, the emergency planning, and the willingness to ask what happens if the ground moves more than expected. Because by the time water appears where it should not be, the system may already be late. At Baldwin Hills, the first warning came hours before the breach. That warning mattered. It started a response. It led to evacuation. It helped save lives that might otherwise have been lost. But the warning could not stitch the liner back together. It could not stop seepage that had already found a path. It could not put eroded material back under the dam. It could not give the reservoir the 24 hours it needed when the structure had only a few hours left. 5 people were killed, and a neighborhood below the hill was changed by a failure that began out of sight. The fact that the death toll was not far higher should never make the event feel small. It should make the lesson sharper. The emergency response reduced the human loss. The system failure still happened. That is the uncomfortable truth at the center of Baldwin Hills. The story does not give us a simple villain. It does not end with one person making one obvious mistake. It shows something more useful and more unsettling. A system can notice danger. A system can react. A system can move people out of harm's way. And still, if the protection was not strong enough before the warning came, the structure can fail. The reservoir above Los Angeles is gone now. The water is gone. The breach was repaired into memory, regulation, reports, and changed oversight. But the question it left behind still matters. Anywhere people live below infrastructure they rarely think about. What happens when the first visible warning is not the beginning of the failure, but the final chance to survive it? Baldwin Hills reminds us that warnings save lives, but real safety has to be built long before anyone hears the water.